raised beds and containers, you can argue are just exactly the same thing. For my purposes, I'm going to make one distinction only, which is when I'm talking about a raised bed, not everybody's not universal. When I'm talking about a raised bed, it's open to the ground.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, it's a bottomless frame. It's like one of those sleazy clubs in Florida, no bottom. Bottomless frame sitting on the ground. A container has a bottom. A raised bed does not.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the only distinction I'm going to make, and I'm only going to make that so that when I am talking about one versus the other, there's going to be a few key critical differences between the two. So, in general, anytime I am talking and you have a question, a comment, an objection, an observation, whatever, just let me know. I'm not going to get that out of shape. For now, I'm going to talk about general theory that applies to both of them, and then I'll get into specifics of raised beds versus containers. I brought a bunch of example containers. I have examples of raised beds. I'm going to talk about specifics of how you do it. But the general principles that are always true are a good place to start because they're what actually really matter. Everything else is just sort of detail. So, first of all, why do you do raised beds or containers? Why add steps? All right. Or sometimes no soil. The awesome things about containers or raised beds, you can take a parking lot and make it into a food forest if you've just got enough containers and the budget for soil. What are other reasons?
My prejudice says it's a little bit easier to control pesky animals.
I like that you started with prejudice, because as I tell my students, anytime I ask a question about modern history, the answer racism is always at least partial credit as to why something is why it is. Okay, so prejudice, pest control. This can be absolutely true depending on the kind of pest. By isolating a container or partially isolating it from the ground, from the earth as a whole, you pay a price, but you also gain advantages. I love to do raised beds open at the bottom, but I still, as I'll talk about later, put like machine cloth or hardwood cloth at the bottom because that isolates them from mammals, basically. I don't get things digging the roots out. Okay, pest control can be useful. What else? It's a term that's really important to me. Raised beds are a great way to develop a specialized microclimate. What's a microclimate?
A smaller environment, so it's more compact.
Yeah, small climate. Macroclimate is we're temperate. You know, we're zone 6A. You have a bunch of different ways to define it, a bunch of different geography ways, whatever. But a microclimate is something like this mushroom bed I just put in over here. It's going to stay shaded almost all year because of the tree overhang. That's going to mean it's going to get less direct rainfall, but it'll actually probably stay slightly moister because of the proximity of the forest. So it'll stay slightly moister, slightly cooler, slightly shadier year-round. That is a microclimate that is distinct from exactly the same bed put 30 feet that way, where it would get full sun with the goods and bads that came with that. The herb garden over there, I first argued for them to put that there because the microclimate created by concrete walls on three sides is that stays hotter and drier than everything around it, which is great for a lot of Mediterranean herbs that tend to like sandy upland places that stay, if they don't like their feet wet, it helps keep pests out of them. It helps avoid mold because they dry out real fast, but you got to be conscious of watering them and things like that, et cetera, et cetera.
So yeah, it also, and I guess this is a microclimate, makes it easier to control watering and nutrition, but on the same scope, they also dry out quicker.
Yep. So you have more granular control over water and nutrition, but also more responsibility. That goes along with microclimates in general. The smaller you get a climatic zone, the more you can twiddle the variables, but that also means the easier it is to like nudge it and destroy it effectively. People that grow the really cool terrariums in like mason jars or whatever, it's possible to get those and get like 10 different plant species and 3 different species of snail. And literally you can put a droplet of the wrong material in it, the whole thing falls apart because the environment doesn't have a lot of slack to soak it up. As opposed to out here, if I took a 55-gallon drum of crude oil and kicked it over, it'd be really bad for the soil right there. But this forest wouldn't care, that forest wouldn't care, the river wouldn't notice, etc. Because for better or for worse, the climate can soak it. Now, of course, that leads to problems where for centuries humans are like, just throw it in the ocean. It's infinite. You know, just throw it in the dump. We got plenty of land. What do you mean don't cut down trees? There's like a bajillion of them. I had a fantastic Native American history teacher in high school who talked about how the Plains Indians used to kill on the order of several 100,000 buffalo, stampeding them off the cliff, and then take like 5. And I was like, wasn't that bad? And she's like, not when there's a billion of them and a few 100,000 of you. No, like the environment can just soak that as a collateral cost. You get better at resource extraction, and all of a sudden, now you're in trouble. So, why raised beds? Because you have poor and no soil. It allows you to create a microclimate with better soil, with better control over water, with better control over soil nutrition. Because again, what do we feed? Not plants. We feed soil. We grow soil. We cultivate soil. As a side effect, sometimes we get fruits, vegetables, leaves, etc. Whereas Fukuoka, the great Fukuoka said in One Star Revolution, ultimately the goal of agriculture is the cultivation of human beings. As other people have said, that's really nice, but I also need to eat, old man. So, you know, perhaps it's both. But in the end, a lot of our efforts is at the cultivation of soil. You know, dirt farmer is sort of a joke, but it's not really a joke. What you farm, if you want to farm effectively, is you farm soil, you make soil, and again, plants are up. So,
and one more thing we didn't touch on was, well, maybe we did, fascinated by videos about these cottage gardens and park to have property.
okay.
You're limited by space, and actually, you did already say that. You're
No,
limited by space. And,
that's a good one to point out, is density. Even if you have great soil, by terracing, say, you can, and again, all of these are wrapped together. I've got really great soil, but I've got a 10 by 10 yard of it, and that's it. Well, I can grow 10 by 10 of tomatoes, or I can put in a series of raised beds that terrace that utilize different levels, you know, and I can get like twice as much food in the same space by growing at multiple levels, by stacking boxes, et cetera, et cetera. And I can grow multiple cycles throughout the year. Again, that's this real wizardry, that sort of conscientious design of small spaces. And recognize too, none of this is radical or new. This is how humans largely grew food for most of history. It's only relatively recently we've moved away from that. The reason we've moved away from that is if you have access to massive amounts of cheap petrochemical energy, you can farm at an industrial scale as an industrial process and produce bulk commodities very cheaply. And I'm not going to knock that. Again, we live for the first time effectively, like a blink of an eye ago, starvation is an active specter haunting all of us all the time. The risk of my children will die because there will not be enough food calories tomorrow. Food scarcity is still absolutely a thing in the United States, but it does not haunt everybody all the time the way it just used to. Like, yeah, sometimes everybody dies because the climate goes weird. Reminded recently for all the difficulty the last 2 years have been. In the year like 825, there was a volcanic explosion, and it basically the sun never got hot for 2 years. They talk about in Beijing that they had snow in August. They talk about in Europe that basically for the entire year it was like it was gray and overcast all the time, and the sun was a watery disk and no plants grew. And like that's generally regarded as the worst 2 years in all of recorded human history. And if that happened now, that would be bad. But we would probably be able to soak it. We've got enough. We produce enough food. We have enough stored. We have enough salvaged and canned and things like that. And that's really astonishing by again all of prior history.
Well, we saw last summer at this time, everybody was putting in produce gardens because they couldn't get stuff at the grocery store.
And they didn't know what was going to happen. And I'm a big fan of moving back to the Victory Gardens model. Again, I'd love to see 10 to 15% of the population engaged in agriculture. And if you had that, basically every human being in the world could eat local food basically all the time. And that would be better for everybody. But, you know, I have not yet been assigned the role of God, Emperor of Earth. But, you know, when I am, soon, so any day, right? Surely everybody will understand. Will for hegemony. Okay. So that's why. Let's talk about how. These are the big picture things we need to take into account. And usually we jump immediately into nuts and bolts, like how do you do it? I'm not going to do that. I'm going to say where I always start with everything is the most important question and one that people frequently skip, which is why are you doing it? Why, in the sense of like what when you dream about the outcome, like what's this going to look like in a year? What is it you're dreaming about? The reason this is important is know what it is you want to get at it. Your answer is, man, I just want to make so many tomatoes. Awesome. Let's plan for that. There's a specific thing tomatoes want, there's specific ways we do it. If your goal is, I just really want a nice, peaceful place to sit among the flowers, it's like, that's cool. That's probably going to look different than one for maximal tomato production. It's like, I want to make a salad garden. Okay, that's great. That looks different. I want to make a garden that I can put my bird's cage in. That's awesome. That's going to look different. But if we have a notion of what it is we want to get, why we are doing this, what inside us this speaks to, it's going to help us make intelligent decisions. And mostly it's going to help us not get 2 years down the road and be like, damn it. Because if I had just thought about this at the beginning, I wouldn't have put it here, located it this way, done that with it, hammered stakes into the ground here, etc. You know, you want to think about these questions before you've poured the concrete footers, before you've had the dump truck of soil developed, before you've cut a hole in the side of the house, things like that. So, what are reasons people might want to do container gardens or raised beds? Like what is it that resonates with you? Why does this bring you joy?
Fresh seasonal food.
Okay, so food production, that's a great reason. What's another? I made a series of raised beds for my mother for Mother's Day, and the location and design of the beds was based around chiefly because my mother wanted a place she could garden that was highly accessible and she wouldn't forget about. So I placed them in a place that I wouldn't put beds because they don't match what I want out of a bed, and they're wrong size for me because I've got longer arms on them. But they're carefully designed to be very visible. The place she gets out of the car and comes in the house, so she'll see them every day. Their size is easy for her to get to, etc. Because what she envisioned was being able to continue to do gardening as she slows down and gets older and things like that. It's not what I'm aiming for right now, but it's important to. Had I not, if she'd just been like, I want raised beds, great. I put another couple on the back 40. They're 4 feet wide and, you know, blah, blah, blah. You know, it's a bit of a hike to get there, but it's not fun.
There's a aesthetic neatness to it also.
Okay, so if beauty is part of it, that, you know, whatever beauty looks like to you. For me, making things kind of ramshackly out of stuff I find speaks to me at a deep level. My deep goblin redneck roots like that. For other people, they want it to have a particular aesthetic, or they want it to look really clean, or they want it to look really traditional, and that's great. Think through that before you start buying lumber or whatever. You know, measure twice, cut once, but like think through 5 times before you measure twice before you cut once. Okay, we don't have to dwell on this. I like to make it clear that we're not just going to talk about this is how you do raised beds. Because if I say this is how you do them, what I'm really saying is this is how I do them because it works for me, but I'm not you. So like, do what works for you. That said, you have a reason. You want to make some raised beds. Let's talk through what you need to consider, regardless of the size, the shape, the construction, etc. Most important thing of all, sun access. Why is sun access the most important thing of all?
They have to grow.
Yeah, I mean, they need sun to grow. They also need water and soil. But what can you do with water and soil that you can't do with sun?
Add it.
Yeah, you can import water and soil. You cannot import sunshine. Not in an efficient way for the scale we're talking about, at least. So, very generic rectangular raised bed is the model for now. How do we always want to orient our raised beds by default, unless we have a specific reason to do otherwise?
South facing. South.
Always want to orient beds towards the south. Why?
Sun moves from east to west.
Okay, we live in the northern hemisphere, which means from our perspective, the sun rises in the east, arcs across the south half of the sky, and goes to the west, which means if you want full sun, and virtually all food crops that we grow in our hemisphere are either have to have full sun or produce better in full sun. And there's a basic physics theory. You got to have joules of sunlight to make joules of food calories. You want it oriented towards the south. Now we say we want it oriented south, meaning what? Meaning what dimension should be oriented towards the south?
Pretty much the way you do it.
Okay, why? Why not make it long ways towards the south? For plants.
Maximize the exposure with the long.
Okay, good. When it is long ways, so if the south is here, this is a bed coming out of the screen. See? But let me do it this way. This is my raised bed. If this is south and I am the sun, then in the morning, these plants get hit hard, and then they start to get into shade from the plants over here, and then they're actually end up almost fully shaded once the plants grow up, particularly if they're bushy, like say bushy green beans. The plants at the end aren't getting any sun by the end of the day, whereas these guys are getting absolutely hammered by the western sun. And side note there, afternoon western sun is much harsher than eastern sun. The why of that appears to actually be super complicated, but the practical gist of it is the case that western sun figure as being much harsher than eastern sun. Dries things out, kills them a lot faster. For example, I grow pepper plants, and I always grow pepper plants so they get eastern sun exposure, but not western sun, because in our climate, by late summer, western sun exposure burns the peppers. They actually end up with burn spots on them. So I put tomatoes between my peppers and the west, because the tomatoes are masochists and will soak it indefinitely, but the peppers aren't. They don't. So if I make the long axis of the bed to the south, things actually don't get very even sun. The stuff in the west part of the bed gets too much, stuff in the east part gets too little. So what I do instead, if this is the south, and I'm like this, then during the early morning, all the plants in the bed get eastern sun. And over the course of the day, they continue to get it. And in theory, at like high noon, some of that stuff gets shaded, but by high noon in summer, the sun can be effectively considered to be directly overhead. So all the plants still get good sun, and they get good sun, and they get good sun, and they share the western sunlight as well. So again, if I'm looking for really good full sun conditions, I want to orient it long axis towards the south. What's the I don't like to labor this if everybody gets it, but this is like super important. Okay, now not everything wants full sun. If I'm like, man, I just really want to grow lettuce because I'm super into lettuce and spinach. This bed will just cook the shit out of lettuce and spinach. Like it will kill them absolutely dead. A good bed for lettuce and spinach would be one right up against the east wall of my house. So it gets that nice morning sun, and the sun comes up and it knocks the dew off so that the plants don't get a lot of slugs, and it makes the creepy crawlers eat them. And then we get to noon, it's right up against the wall of my house. And so it goes into shade, and it's in shade the rest of the day, and it stays sufficiently moist. Again, one of the great things you have to learn in gardening is when they say this is a full sun, all full sun is not the same. Full sun for tomatoes is not the same as full sun for peppers, is not the same as full sun for cabbage or lettuce. And there's a level of just like learning your particular climate and microclimate from that perspective. Full sun directly against the south wall of a house that's a concrete thick wall is very different than full sun directly south in the middle of a field, is very different from full sun south backing up to a forest. All three of those are going to, up against the wall is going to hold heat and reflect sun. You're going to get an increase in sun. You're actually going to, I have a south wall of my house that's a big concrete wall like I'm talking about that effectively operates at a climate zone warmer than the rest of the yard. I'm growing a Persian fig in that climate that is not hardy in Connecticut, but it's hardy up against the wall of my house. It dies back down in its pot every year, got it in a big container, but it comes back from the roots quite happily because up against that wall stays just warm enough that it doesn't freeze solid all the way down. Things like rosemary likewise can be tricked into surviving in this climate if you get it up against a southern exposure. You get a microclimate where the ground doesn't freeze solid all the way down. So another reason to do container gardening is you isolate them thermally, so it's possible to pull off effects with soil that you can't get with the larger earth. They heat up faster, they also cool down faster. Okay, so sun, I think we're good on. Any questions? Okay. Water. Plants need water. Hopefully I'm not moving too fast for anybody here. But assuming everybody's got that point, really when we're talking about raised beds and containers, what I'm talking about is consider, so first thing to consider is orientation towards the sun. And again, dig up something so I don't forget about it. A website I have just learned about relatively recently, suncalc.net. Suncalc.net is a website where some clever person utilized a Google Maps API. Basically, you can go anywhere on the planet and look at a given point where the sun will be at the sky at different arbitrary times of day or of the year. So like literally I zoomed into that south wall of my house, put the marker right there, and it was like, yes, at 6 a.m. on today, the sun will be here and it'll arc across the sky like this, etc. So that was pretty keen, and that's a great way to evaluate how much sun exposure from what angle at what time you're going to get. There are all kinds of fancy things people bring in here, like there's sun timers, which are these remarkably expensive, like solar arrays that you put out that measure when the sun began and stopped. And mostly I think it's probably more useful to go out and be like, where's there a lot of grass? Where's the grass like dead, and where's the grass like really lush? Now we have insight into what gets sun and what gets a lot of sun and what gets sun only during part of the day. But you know, do what you need to do. So we figured out sun orientation. The next question is irrigation. Any raised bed smaller than like 8 by 4, or that doesn't get absolutely full exposure to the sky, is probably going to need irrigation. And even then, an 8 by 4 bed that's just soil on top of concrete is going to need irrigation. Basically, anything that's not directly attached to the larger planet and deep and full of moisture holding is going to need irrigation. And even then, even if it's got all those characteristics, it may need irrigation at certain points. So consider from the beginning how you're planning to do that. If the answer is, I'm just going to get up in the morning and pull on my slippers and go water it because that makes me feel good, that's great. But be honest, are you actually going to do that? Are you going to be capable of doing that? Are you going to have time for it? Are you going to be physically able? If you're going to do that, where's the water coming from? Think through. Oh, I've got, I've still a watering can. Okay, where did you fill the watering can? Because if the answer is at the kitchen sink and that's up 3 flights of stairs, probably not a good idea to probably grow a half-acre of corn with that method. On the other hand, if it's, I've got a hose right here, and I have a hose that's, now that it's not going to freeze anymore, I have a nice big hose that's got like 3 hoses linked on it. It's got a sprayer handle. But at this point, because I'm irrigating a bunch of clover to get it started, I just leave it in the yard, and I come out once a day, turn it on, and walk around irrigating everything, and then leave it where it stands, and that's where I start the next day and do the same path. But that's because I know I have a hose, and I know how much I can pull from my well at a given time without causing trouble, so on and so forth. What are ways to irrigate a raised bed? One is just rain. So ask, how much rainfall are you going to get? Remember, Connecticut, New England in general is a moist climate, but the moisture is not well distributed and is less well distributed with each passing year. As the climate heats up, we're actually going to get wetter, but we're going to get longer dry spells and wetter wet spells. So as you plan, look a year ahead, 5 years ahead, 10 years ahead, make sure that your setup can handle occasional inundation. It rains a half an inch an hour for 10 hours. But also can handle weeks at a stretch without rain if it's a high July drought. Make sure you can accommodate that.
In our area of Connecticut, tends to be drier than most of the states.
Yeah, it can be. Yeah. So think about rain regardless. Again, you put all this effort in and you build this great raised bed that sits at the bottom of a broad, shallow depression in the lawn, and then you get one of those torrential rains and the soil becomes completely waterlogged and everything dies, and you're very sad. Avoid that by, thinking through. That's also another reason to use raised beds, is you can get above a water table that's very shallow, that's giving you trouble. So
without a raised bed, you can trench in various places in your garden to hold
Sure.
the water, but the
Absolutely.
raised bed kind of defeats that.
yes, and yeah. I'm a big fan of berms and swales and all kinds of water management, but they won't let me use that person. So rain is one. What's another way to irrigate a raised bed?
A hose.
What did you say?
A hose.
Hose. All right. So hose, hand watering, like we discussed.
Mm.
What else?
Saving gray water.
Okay, that's not a how. That's where you get the water from. But how do we get the water to the
But
bed?
I've seen a couple of local gardens where they have gray water containers right at the end of the garden. And that way, they still have to have a hose that can gravity feed, and it's a short distance to the garden.
Okay, all right. I also want to talk about pipes and drips. Okay. We've talked about rain. Everybody gets how rain works, but you understand rain is not super reliable. So rain may be part of it, but you're going to have a backup strategy, particularly again, if you're up against a house, say, we're going to get less rain, or you're under an eave, where you're going to get no rain. Make sense? Hose. Hose is great. How much hose do you have? Is it going to be, again, I turned off the hose here that was watering because it's gotten driven over again and smashed. And so the hoses aren't yet. So is the hose having to come through a high traffic area? Are you having to drag it across terrain that's going to shred it? Are you physically capable of moving 100 feet of hose there and back every day? Maybe you are, and that's great. Maybe you're not, or you don't want to.
100 feet of hose builds up a lot of pressure with the water if you're not watching it.
Yes, it does. Also true. And again, for me, I have an old well, so I can't pull that. If I just attach a hose to it, turn the hose on full, it'll just pull the well dry and it will burn out my well motor. So I got to be careful about that. Hand watering is awesome, and hand watering can be connected to things like I got big rainwater barrels, things like that that are great for that, but it's labor intensive. Water is heavy. Also, what feels like a really thorough watering with hand watering is not generally a very thorough watering. It's enough watering to keep it wet for about half a day. So we have hand watering. One of the things you can do if you're building a big container garden or a big raised bed, in particular from the beginning, you can put in irrigation piping or put in irrigation drip hose. If you got the money to spend, irrigation pipes in particular are great if you're going to be careful about it. You'll know what I'm talking about.
Not really.
Get like half-inch PVC pipe, drill holes in it. Here's your bed, and you lay the pipes connected together with pipe stuff like so, and then you have a pipe sticking up in one corner. When you want to water, you can even get a threaded thing where you just screw a hose on and turn the hose on and just let the hose run for an hour or two. Or you just, pour water in or something like that. Basically, it's a much more, you may still need to use a hose or hand watering, but it allows you to deliver water much, much more efficiently to the root zone. So you're not getting water puddling on the surface, which can make seeds float away, which is always irritating when you seed real carefully and then you water and all the seeds clump to one side because the bed isn't absolutely level. You don't get water on leaves, which is how you often get mold and mildew issues. You deliver water right to the root zone, which encourages lush root growth rather than shallow root growth, because that's one of the issues with hand watering. You do a constant shallow watering, which encourages a lot of root growth right at the surface, which makes the plants very vulnerable to drought.
Is that on the very bottom of the bed?
No, actually. So that's going to depend on the depth of the bed, but generally, something like that might be, say, 12 inches down.
Okay.
Well, no, actually, I take it back. Something like that, you probably want to put about 6 inches down.
Okay.
It's going to also depend on exactly what you do. If you put it all the way at the bottom of the bed, the bed's 2 feet deep, it's going to be below the root zone of most plants.
Yeah.
Put it all the way at the surface, it's going to, the problem with it at the surface is it's easier to damage it by accident as you move things around, stuff like that. Again, designing a system like this is a huge amount of information online. And again, the most useful thing to do is not, in my experience, look for how to do this article, because that's one person's experience. It's look for like mistakes I made, not even common mistakes or like, here's an article, but someone saying, here is a system I did. Here's what went wrong. Here's how I corrected it. That gives you actual useful data on someone's experience.
Okay.
I've even seen people take systems like this and just lay them on top of the bed but essentially that's the same as a drip hose. You all know what a drip
Yeah.
watering hose is?
Mhm.
Problem with drip hoses are great, but the UV radiation destroys them usually in about a season. And I hate just like burning through hose till but they're impossible to repair because it's made essentially out of neoprene. So you can make a drip hose by getting a nice hose and drilling pinholes in it, which is sort of labor intensive, but it lasts a lot longer. Or you can take that same drip hose and bury it right under the mulch layer and get 2 or 3 years out of it usually, which again is a great thing to do if you're building a bed that you're going to use for a while. Biggest thing you have to do with this is have a good idea of where it is. You do not want to swing a shovel into this and be like, oh man, past me put a lot of labor in the system that I just wrecked in a moment of crisis.
What is a drip hose? Does it have a layer of some kind of absorbent material?
The drip hose is basically a hose made out of this like porous neoprene. So it feels sort of foamy but solid, but when you hook it up and put it under pressure, it just sort of, water just beads on the surface along its whole length and drips out constantly. A standard drip hose delivers something like a gallon per foot per hour, which again is great. You lay it all around the base of the plant. You just crank it on for an hour or two, and it really deeply saturates the soil without getting the leaves wet. If you actually, agronomy research shows that if you're watering through like spraying water in the air, something in the order of half your water is just lost to evaporation just out of the gate, and that's even in a water-rich climate like Connecticut, that's a level of waste that sort of sets my teeth on edge.
Because I have like beds that were just built one last year and they're like half or maybe that much full. So I could probably with dirt.
Sure. And
put-
again, in talking about raised beds, it's sort of hard. All of this ties together because I'm already talking about plant depth and mulch depth, and we'll get on that later, but I can't make it all happen at once.
Yeah.
But yeah, water methods are important and being aware of what your water method is. We follow?
Mhm.
I've got a container right now, friend gave me, made out of wood. It's got corrugated, like French drain pipe laid across the bottom. The black plastic stuff about yay big with holes poked in it. And then it's just got a PVC pipe sticking out of the dirt. It's on top of this. You dump water in the PVC pipe, the porous, the drain pipe, dump water in the PVC pipe. The French drain pipe at the bottom is just a water reservoir. It's conveniently shaped and cheap to get. It's strong enough to have dirt dumped on top because it's designed for drains down to the ground. So plants grow here. You water with this. Water wicks up through the soil as needed. Plants can actually dip roots down into this area as needed, and the bed stays very moist basically all the time. I built a much simpler version of this years ago. Living in a rental house in Willimantic, I took just those like $2 plastic tubs, and I took one of those trays like you get like plants come in from the greenhouse, things like that, flipped it upside down in the bottom to create a reservoir space, put like netting on top of it, put dirt on it, planted tomatoes, and that was it. Oh, I put drain holes above the reservoir area, so if it really rained on it torrentially, it would drown the tomatoes. But like that was it. They grew lush and great tomatoes. And then I passed the design on to some friends who were living in Chicago, and they were like, "Oh, look at all these tomatoes we grew in an alley. It was awesome." So reservoirs for water are awesome. If you're actually building serious raised beds or containers, got the wherewithal, it's surprisingly easy to do. And again, ways to do that can include French drain pipe, which again, the corrugated black stuff, it's flexible, but it's strong enough to have dirt stacked on top of it. That's great because again, it's cheap and it's strong. And it lasts basically, it's designed to be planted in the ground basically indefinitely. You want to get really fancy, if you put it in the bottom of a container, you can surround it with gravel, but you don't have to. And jumping topics, side note, you never, ever, ever need to put gravel in the bottom of a container or a pot. It does not improve drainage. That is a myth. In fact, it often makes drainage worse. Go. Soil all the way to the bottom. To put it this way, if you needed a layer of rocks below the dirt for things to drain properly, the Almighty would have put a layer of rocks below the dirt for things to drain properly. They did not, and so it is not necessary. Intuitively, it makes sense, but like literal serious research in agriculture is showing that it doesn't actually do anything for drainage better. It just makes your soil more shallow. Okay. Another part of water Irrigation is to compensate for deficiency, but we also have to compensate for excess. You have that parking lot that you're going to grow plants in, and you put that giant metal tub, which can be an awesome container, and then you get torrential rain, and literally the soil lifts up like a hydrostatic pop swimming pool and dumps out of the sides. What did you do wrong?
No drainage.
You don't have any drainage. There's no place for water to go. You've got this 150-gallon tub full of dirt. Well, now it's dirt plus 150 gallons of water, and the dirt loses that battle. How do you deal with excess? How do you eliminate excess? What do I mean? What do you do with excess water?
Holes.
Okay, most classic way of all, your standard container. Have a hole in the bottom, yeah? Everybody understands this is a cross section? Like I said, no gravel, no pot shards, no whatever in the bottom. But do you have like screen to keep your dirt from coming out through the hole? But make sure it's not so fine that again, it gets plugged up. And some, depending on your soil, some soils can just handle without falling into the hole. Actually, screen most of the roots tend to escape the hole after a while. You try to move the plant and it's embedded itself into the crack in the cement or whatever. So minimum for drainage on any pot is going to be a ½ inch. Basically, smaller than that, the water doesn't flow effectively, and so the pot tends to pound. You'll notice on commercial plant pots, which reuse fine for quite a few seasons, that they have multiple holes. And in fact, I have added holes so that it drained even better. Ones like this come with a little reservoir on the bottom, which is nice, and the place you can dump water directly into the reservoir. That's cool. Talk about these later. And of course, if you're doing what I'm calling raised beds, they're just open to the ground. The ground can soak a fair amount of water. Basically, you hit a point where the ground itself cannot soak the excess water. You're kind of sunk anyway. So yeah. You have drains, and ask the question, if you're dealing with large scale containers, where does the runoff go? If your massive big brick container that drains through one little pipe, where does that pipe empty to? Does that pipe empty to a place that now you're going to be walking through water to get to your front door? Does it empty through places that now it's undercut the foundation of the house? This sounds silly right up until you make one of these mistakes, and then you've got an issue. Or did you position it such where it drains into a low-lying spot in your yard that you've now planted a red osier, or dogwood, or a little nano willow, or something like that, or an elderberry that'll flourish from that water, and now you'll stack functions and improve your plant. Okay. Any other questions about water? Okay, let's talk about soil. What kind of soil do you need in a container or in a raised bed?
I can tell you what I do. I won't tell you it's right.
Okay, what do you do?
Well, I mulch my yard waste, and so I've got that in one container. Because I've had to start the soil somewhere. I don't have enough topsoil to just move it. Is I usually go a half humus with manure and topsoil mix, and then half as much of just the regular topsoil, which is just mulched, really dark soil like you get at the local store.
All right, that sounds fantastic. Soil can be surprisingly expensive if you're trying to buy any volume. It's also one where that cost can drop tremendously if you have a vehicle that can move it. Again, I have an old pickup truck. You can buy gravel for $20 a ton at the surface mine in Winco. That same amount bought in bags at Home Depot would be like $3,000. Like you could buy the truck and buy the gravel for the cost of buying it, paying someone else to bag it and ship it to Home Depot and label it for you. Soil is not quite that kind of price break, but it is significant. And when you're talking about filling a significant number of containers, you do the math. Not even that much in your mind container, suddenly you're talking about it's cheaper to get a dump truck. Look for places that have moved up delivery of soil, buy by the cubic yard. But also be aware, places will say, oh yeah, this is good growing soil, and it's not, it's garbage. It's the dirt they sell from the surface mine that's just tailings mixed with a few bucketfuls of compost that we're going to say is dirt. Can you grow stuff in that? Sure. But it'll compact and you'll need to do a lot with it to grow it into good soil. If you're not interested in that undertaking, which I have done and can be very rewarding, but like the circumstances are pretty specific. How do we fill a bed with soil at a way that is cost effective and also gets us reasonably good soil to start with?
And again, I'm sure this is not a good idea, but I do it.
That's the confidence we
when
need. That's the
when I started the raised beds, I half filled them with the stuff the town recycles.
Okay.
So
That's
I
not
didn't, I
bad.
didn't put that near the top of the bed because I knew it wasn't very clean.
Well, yeah, and honestly, the industrial compost the town of Linda makes is not great. It's not terrible by a long shot. It is compost. The biggest issue with it, yeah, is the debris you get in it, the plastic.
And the
bits that
advantage
break
was
it down.
it's all free.
Yeah, the fact that it's free goes a long way to ameliorate issues, particularly again when you need, when you need a dump truck load of it. Because a dump truck load, last time I looked, a dump truck load of soil from a commercial delivery place, and a dump truck load is like 10 plus cubic yards. It's a lot of dirt, but you're still talking like $600-700. So the way that I do mostly raised beds, not containers. Part of the reason for that being that managing the containers require a lot. Container gardening is hard. It requires a lot more attention than raised beds because again, you've got a very small contained climate. So you miss a couple of days of watering because things get busy and everything dies, and that's it. Container beds are a lot more forgiving because they are connected to the planet Earth. Sorry, raised beds are a lot more forgiving than containers because that's what I'm saying. When I fill a raised bed, this is how I do it. So I've got cross section of my frame sitting on the ground, right? This is pretty labor intensive, but you only have to do it once. I dig down to the depth of the raised bed. The top layer I pull off, that's grass and nice organic matter. Ideally, I set that in one pile. The subsoil layers that are pretty easy to tell because they change color rapidly. There's a pretty distinct color break. That are not organic rich, I put in a different pile. Having dug this hole, I fill it with rotten logs, and sticks, and leaf matter, stuff I pull out of the forest. Big stuff on the bottom, smaller stuff on the top. If one does not live adjacent to a forest, if you look around and speak to your neighbors and just keep your eyes peeled, you'll usually be able to find before too terribly long somebody who left a pile of firewood out and didn't cover it properly, and now it's taking up space next to their driveway, and they know they need to get rid of it, but it's such a hassle, and they're going to get to it. Stop bothering things like that. And often those people are baffled, but generally pretty willing to let you come by with the container and take a bunch of logs. And what you're looking for, ideally, the ideal thing for a setup like this is you've got like a piece of cut firewood that you can start tearing apart with your hands that's got the texture and moisture of like a dish sponge. That's good stuff. If you can't get that, next best is brand new fresh stuff. Like a storm brought down a tree in my neighbor's yard and they chopped it up and they wanted the good quality stuff for firewood, but all the branches and stuff. Yeah, okay, you'll haul them off, I'll cut them to 6-foot lengths. Great, done. Because that's still nice and moist, and pretty soon down in the earth, that'll break into that nice spongy stuff. Further than that, if you don't have that, then just, again, logs that rug out of the woods that are moist and partly broken down. What I do not want is stuff that's, the tree fell and there's that branch that sticks up and now it's absolutely bone dry and it hasn't changed in 4 years. That will take years and years and years and years to even get moist all the way through. That's no good. That's also why I don't use like tail ends from the lumber yard, because those have been kiln dried to very, very dry. Those take a long time to moisten back up and serve it by design. So, rotten stuff. What if I don't have logs? Okay. Do you have leaf debris? can you fill this full enough? If you fill this with just leaves, you need to fill it to like the height of the bed because that stuff will compress real good. That's not nearly as good as the logs for reasons I can go into, but like it's still doable. But essentially, you know, you also can trench compost. I mean, there's people that do this and just fill this with kitchen waste. That requires a lot of kitchen waste, so generally, unless you've got access to like farm level, you know, if you've got access to like 200 pounds of spent hops or something like that. But yeah, some sort of organic matter.
Can I guess, you don't want a piece of rotted firewood that's infested with ants?
Doesn't matter. Ants won't do anything. Ants won't do anything. Pine beetles won't do anything. None of those creatures will affect your plants. Basically, the ants will crawl out. The pine beetles will probably just die. And either way, as the soil, it beats the soil. So I laid that basically in a big mound. Again, I'm talking about big old logs and branches, and then like woodsy tree and some leaves, things like that. I lay that in a big sort of mound till it's roughly ground level, and I kind of smooth it to ground level. Then take my frame and I put that layer of hardware cloth stapled at the bottom of the frame across it. Why do I do that?
Pests. Voles.
Voles, chipmunks,
Pests.
woodchucks, anything that likes to burrow up from below, now can't burrow up from below, but hardware cloth with 1/2 inch or 1/4 inch. I try to do 1/4 inch because that really excretes stuff. Roots can go through that just fine. Flora and fauna of the small scale can go through fine, but mammals can't go through it. That's what stuff. Then I dump back in that subsoil and that organic layer on top. And I try to time it out where I've got a couple of three, I mean, ideally I want 5 inches, but really nowadays, if I do a 12-inch high bed, I dig probably 8 inches into the ground. So I have a good 3 or 4 inches on top. As I flip it over, and then at the very top layer, I put 3 inches of organic mulch. And if I'm doing real good, I then leave it for a year.
So the grass stuff you put back in?
Yeah, I take the
Put that under the dirt and things, so it doesn't really matter.
subsoil and then the topsoil. I recreate the layer cake that was there before. I usually flip the grass side down because it dies faster. And then organic mulch. And that's not entirely true. Usually I'd put a good inch of really nice compost, and then I'll put mulch on top of it. I mulch almost exclusively with wood chips. Fight me, die angry. I say that because people have a lot of strong opinions about wood chips. I think most of them are wrong. But yeah, I also can get wood chips from Public Works in my town pretty easy. So I have the long driveway pad, and then right off of that is basically a train car load of wood chips that I just have to refresh continuously. And as it breaks down, like I'll let one part break down and I'll use that after a year or two for mulch. And then I'll use this part now that it's broken down and have it done most of the year.
Evergreen chips are really acidic. But,
No.
No.
That is not correct.
No.
Evergreen chips, sorry, I don't mean that harshly, but this is
No,
one of
no,
those
no.
things
Well,
that
my
people say.
next statement was going to be, but mulch is basic, so the two would counteract. But I probably got that all back.
No, it's okay. You're shoot. Okay, so coniferous mulches are shot through with pinene. Pinene is a resinous material. That's how it's spelled. Pinene's so named because it's what gives things the smell of pine. That Christmas smell, that's pinene resin. Pinene resin is potently antifungal. It's not really that coniferous wood chips are acidic. It is that because of the pinene, they prevent fungal action for a long time. And fungal action is what does the huge majority of the work of breaking down woody material that's not a bacterial dominated composting. It's not a hot compost like you do in a compost bin that's bacterial dominated. This is by and large fungal dominated, which is how composting works in the real world. It's like how forest floors compost is fungal action, which means that they are not a good choice in some cases. Now, pine needles have a slightly different effect, and et cetera, et cetera. But the big issue with all of these is that, you know, does piney material, pine wood, pine needles, can those ever be good mulch? Well, of course, if you walk into my woods and they're dominated by white pines, I can drive my fist 6 inches deep into the fluffy black. It's fantastic. It just takes a while. It takes longer for them to break down. You chip a pine tree, and those pine chips may take 3 or 4 years to really darken up. You chip a sugar maple or a rock maple, which is a really hard wood that's also molecularly really porous, and in a season they'll be turning to nice black stuff. But a lot of that gets way over. What really happens most of the time is that it's less relevant than people think what kind of wood chips you put on. I'm going to jump ahead to mulch here if that's all right, because we've had some good questions. What happens is people take a bunch of like pine, and often they take pine that it's a lot of heartwood pine, dry. Somebody ground up a bunch of pine, and it's not green material, it's dry material, and so they put a 6 inches of dry pine shavings, like you line a hamster cage with, and they're like, my tomatoes didn't like it. It's like, well, tomatoes didn't like it because like it was dry and shit, and you didn't like it. You took that same stuff and you saturated it with water so that it really got the soil underneath moist and things like that. Probably the tomatoes would think it was fine. But what can happen, you also chip that pine, chip green pine, and the piney resin is not really water soluble, but enough to get down and can kill some fungal action. But again, sometimes tomatoes, that's not really a problem. What I would do though, somebody say, I can deliver you a truckload of chipped pine from the storm damage. That's great. Put it right there so that next year, after it's had a year of being rained on and soaking in and starting to break down, a lot of the stuff that trees have all kinds of materials in them to ward off the universe. They have antifungal and antibacterial materials coursing through them all the time. But those take energy to maintain. So once the tree has died and those aren't maintained, they start to break down. So you give it a while, it breaks down, you're doing okay. Now, of course, people are like, okay, but I have a condo, I don't have a place to put a ton and a half of wood chips. Fair. This may not be the method for you. Again, that's why I don't say this is how to do raised beds, because what works for me may not work for you. But other things that you can get on a small scale, leaves, particularly leaves if you can shred them. Well, how do I shred them? I don't have a leaf shredder. You have a lawnmower? Somebody around you have a lawnmower. Run a lawnmower over a pile of dry leaves a few times and you get beautiful shredded leaf material. All of this stuff gets better if you let it age. That's how the natural world works, but a lot of it can be used fresh. Straw is another great example. I don't like straw because it's expensive, particularly nowadays because it's an in thing. It used to be 20 years ago that if you just went to somebody that made straw and said, yeah, I need your off straw, I need your rock straw that got too wet, they'd be happy to get rid of it. Nowadays, they're like, that's great. That's $7 a bale rather than $8 a bale because there's a demand for it. But if you can get straw cheaply, that also works great. Almost any organic material can make great mulch. There are people that mulch with just straight compost. I don't like to do that because the top layer of the compost dries out and I feel like that's sort of wasteful compost, but like it works. I get it. I'm not saying it doesn't work. Mulching with something like just cardboard way down the stones will actually work real well. If you put like 4 or 5 inches of cardboard, it works real well. I just think it looks really weird, and you do get some critters that like to hang out. But yeah, I tend to use rotted, broken down wood chips on top of compost, and I just scoop the stuff out of the way to plant in. If you want to read delightful accounts of this kind of gardening from Connecticut, read Ruth Stout's books. If you read only one account of an 80-year-old woman gardening naked by putting 8-inch piles of organic material over every possible surface, there's really only one to read, and it's Ruth Stout's, but it's worth the read. But yeah, the entirety of the Ruth Stout method is basically 8 inches of organic matter over everything at all times. She used straw because at the time you could get that by the wagon load really cheaply. But again, virtually anything will work. I put the compost over, then put the layer of mulch. And again, ideally, I let it sit for a while, let it cook for a while, because if I do that, it'll be much better off. If I can't, That's okay. It's just not ideal. This is how I get the dirt though. I dig the dirt out of the ground and then I replace the space the dirt took up with stuff that's a waste material that I can find a lot of places. Then I have my layer of dirt. Basically, the only investment I make is the compost. And even then, that's literally, I mean, my compost is made out of cat food. Our 4 cats use a litter box where we use hardwood pellets, which are cheaper and much more environmentally friendly than standard cat litter. They poop in that, you dump it in the composter, it gets to about 180 degrees, it cooks thoroughly, and it makes just beautiful compost that the worms then finish off from.
Is that your feeling on any animal waste? We just say the same thing.
I don't compost our dog waste because since our dogs are indoor-outdoor dogs, our dogs take antihelminthics, that is, they take deworming medicine, and there's pretty good evidence that deworming medicine passes through undigested enough that it tends to be, particularly if you're concentrating a bunch of it in one place, it tends to be harsh on the local worm ecology. But that's what we do with all the cat waste. We have chickens. The chickens scratch in a combination of sawdust and wood chips because most of those are free. And they drop super high nitrogen poop on them, and they stir them up, and they walk around, and then it rains, and it turns into this beautiful black stuff that I scoop up with a snow shovel and put on beds. So, questions about this? This is one way to do it. You say, what if I'm really not keen on digging into my soil 10 inches? Or like I just told you I'm doing it on cement. Why weren't you listening? You know, where do you get the dirt from? You can get, again, dirt delivered in bulk. And if you are buying dirt, basically, let me look up my ratios. It's something I have to write down because it's I'm hoping those two sounds are unrelated. Classic sort of mix is like a third well-rotted compost and a third water holding material. What are water holding materials? Any guesses?
Well, the rotted leaves and compost are pretty good water holding.
They are. The really classic water holding materials are basically inert materials that just soak. The classic one is peat moss. Peat moss is terribly environmentally destructive, so don't use peat moss. Coconut coir is one that's much less of an issue. It's an industrial byproduct for a thing that can be grown sustainably. It's a tree crop.
Why is the peat moss environmentally destructive?
Because peat moss takes hundreds of thousands of years to accumulate, and then it takes about 10 minutes to dig up. So digging it up in mass to put in people's
Oh,
gardens.
it's destructive for the environment.
Yeah,
I-
yeah.
you know-
Basically, it's essentially to get peat moss effectively is mined. Is the way to put it. It's not really a sustainably produced product. There's a finite amount if we just dig it up.
If I go over to Home Depot and get that 40-pound bag of peat moss, they have it all over the place. You know, it's like
Yeah. I
stacks.
mean, again, they also have coal all over the place, but that's also not a great. As it turns out, there's some issues with that. And again, I have used peat moss, but I got like one 40-pound bag that was enough for 2 nursery beds where I needed real particular water characteristics, and that will last effectively forever at this point. I don't want to fill a whole bunch of beds with new peat moss every season, whatever. So a third aeration material. And again, the classic aeration material is perlite. What is perlite? Perlite is just a mineral that they grind into little pieces. And again, it's terrible. Don't use perlite. Perlite's super energy expensive, and again, they just mine it out of the ground. What I would use instead of perlite, things like rice hulls, which you can actually buy in like 50, 60-pound bags online. They're not super cheap because having 50, 60 pounds of something shipped to you isn't necessarily cheap, but one compressed bag of 60 pounds of rice hulls is a whole lot of rice hulls. And basically what they do is they make the soil fluffier. Now, again, I'm giving you this because this is sort of the classic thing. I don't do anything like this. This is, if I was going to spend money on something, I wouldn't do this. A slightly nicer one you can dig up or buy native soil, quarter that. Oh, excuse me, half that. 25% finished compost. And then 25% partially finished compost. And again, partially finished means like a leaf pile that you've left for a year, where it started to break down, but it's certainly not done yet. You know, grass clippings that have been allowed to age for a few months, that kind of stuff. Compost provides a lot of your nutrients. The native soil provides a lot of your bulk, and the partially finished stuff provides a lot of your variation. If I were
The
making,
nice thing with this relationship is it also keeps the cost down.
yes, if I were filling a big container and I couldn't dig dirt out of the ground at my house, but I had access to other things I have in my house, here's what I do. %50 would be soil from the surface mine. It's soil in quotes because it's really not soil, it's dirt, it's dead. And it's super fine and powdery. And if you just fill the bed with that, it would turn to cement once it got nice and wet. However, 50% that soil, 50% compost, we're good to go. Do that, mulch it real good. It'll just get better year after year. I have a bed that's actually not even that. It's logs and rotting material covered in probably 6 to 8 inches of the mine soil mixed in with just dirt I dug out of the ground when I was putting the logs in there, and then mulched it real good, and it's flourished. It, you know, a year or two in, and it's got stuff growing on it. You can also just buy garden soil from places that deliver it in mass. It just costs money. Questions on this? That's a great question. The answer is technically yes. You can do, for instance, you want to read textbooks on that. You can get into viticulture where, you know, people that know what they're talking about can sip the wine and be like, oh, wow, there's a lot of sulfur in the soil in your region because it does come through in the taste of the grapes. However, for most people under regular circumstances, I'm going to say probably not. Probably not nearly as much as variety and did you water it enough? For example, onion taste. It's like every given onion has a set amount of onion intensity that God has given it. And whether that's very concentrated or very not concentrated, it depends on how much water you give it to swell up. But it's like you grow onions this big and they're like, oh my God, and you get the same onions this big and like, oh, it's all right. Likewise, tomatoes that get overwatered tend to crack and tend to be sort of watery tasting, maybe a little large. Tomatoes that get underwatered can almost get sort of gummy. It's like they're not pumped up enough. But again, I would say in terms of taste, my experience for what limited value it's worth is that amounts of water and variety of plant chosen end up mattering way more for the taste than the specifics of soil. Well, and you know, again, peat moss is extremely acidic, so it may well be that they picked up some flavor due to the soil chemistry or something like that.
I tried planting cucumbers on Pennsylvania when I've done. They tasted like the clay in the soil. Maybe it's mine.
You may have
Bionic taste buds.
Yeah. You know, I all I can say is my experience doesn't, but again, my experience is I have reasonably good soil that I put a lot of work into like making healthier. And so I don't have a lot of like really extreme soils that might show particular tastes.
When you talked about the taste for chemistry in the soil is also, as we talked the last session I did with you about rotating your plants.
Could be that.
If you're not rotating the plants, it'll just keep deteriorating certain chemicals in the ground, and then you'll get some weird taste because it's no longer getting.
Yeah, if I had to guess, you're probably getting either deficiencies or excesses of micronutrients, which even in small amounts can show up in the taste profile. But yeah, soil is actually often one of the biggest ones because again, oh my God, it doesn't cost this much. And so you go cheap and it doesn't work. And then you're like, well, I'm terrible at this. It was all a waste. Or you're like, oh, I've got to really do it right. You spend like $3,000 on super fancy mix. And it's like, I mean, like,
Gotta grow a lot of
I gotta grow. Yeah, I gotta grow a lot of tomatoes. Like, I'm growing cucumbers. So and you really, it's just like cucumbers will literally grow in horse manure. Like that's their deal. And so, watermelons, if you can get someone to deliver mostly still steaming horse manure and leave it out for about a week, watermelons will happily grow in it. So again, a question of what are you trying to accomplish for how long, etc. We've already started talking about mulch, but I want to hit on it again because it is so important. Whether we're talking about a container or a raised bed, mulch, 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 mulch. You will notice that basically the only I personally don't like it when people say, well, X happens in the natural world because a lot of values for X are things that don't happen in the natural world include composting, as we describe it, agriculture, as we describe it, any of the plants we've bred have specific characteristics. None of those are natural. That said, I think it is worth noting that, for instance, when we leave vast swaths of land open and uncovered, that doesn't happen anywhere in nature except places that we view as being absolutely blasted. Where does that happen? Deserts, by and large. Like one of the defining characteristics of areas that are very, very biologically inert is that they tend to have vast areas where there's no plant life growing. And in fact, deserts consume and destroy other biomes because they wipe out the surface plant life. So do not leave your beds uncovered. That's bad for them. It's bad for the soil. And that's not how plants grow in the real world. Plants aggressively cover any open ground. They do that very quickly. That's why weeding is such a hassle, because things try to fill in the soil. Mulching makes so many things so much easier that it's hard to wrap my head around the fact that people don't mulch all the time everywhere. So we've talked about different kinds of mulch, but the gist of it is mulch with something. To be clear, if you take bare dirt and you lay bricks on it, or like metal cookie sheets on it, and you wait a year and you come back, the soil underneath will be better than when you started. Nobody is exactly sure why this is. This appears to have to do with subsoil organisms releasing gaseous nitrates that get trapped by the mulch and they get converted back into soluble nitrogen. But literally, if you lay plastic sheeting on the ground, or again, bricks on the ground, and leave the ground covered for a year, the soil will be better than when you started. So mulching is magical. Mulching stabilizes soil temperatures. Mulching holds water in. Mulching improves soil tilt. It makes the soil fluffier over time because it protects the soil and allows critters to move around in it.
Just throwing the residue on top of the bed every fall and then taking it off in the springtime, does that accomplish the same thing?
What, from the plants growing?
Is, covering the bed just
With the plants that are growing there?
yeah.
No, there's not going to be nearly enough organic matter in those plants to do that. You're going to get basically this paper thin layer, and then they're not going to break down effectively because there's not going to be enough material. When I'm talking about mulching, I'm talking about 3 to 12 inches of stuff. Mulch like you need. So what I do with the plant, also you don't want to leave the plants growing there down because that tends to, any diseases they have, you're allowing diseases or pests, you're allowing to complete the life cycle in situ. Pull the residues out of the ground at the end of the year, chop them up, put them in the compost bin, turn them into quality stuff, put that back on. So, like I said, I mulch with big, thick layers of wood chips. I often mulch with big, thick layers of wood chips on top of sheeted cardboard. Or sheeted cardboard on top of compost with wood chips on top of it. But the gist of all of it, sometimes I mulch with shredded leaves or just leaf mold, which is just leaves I've let break down for several years. But the gist of all of it is I mulch everything. I try not to leave any soil bare. Soil that's bare gets dry, it turns to dirt, which is not what you want. It turns to desert dirt.
So in your off season, then you're covering with cardboard?
My off season, I I just cover everything with mulch all the time, so there's not really an off season.
Yeah.
Yes, I can do that, or I do cover cropping, which is the other option. What's a cover crop? Basically what it says on the tin. A cover crop is a plant you grow specifically to be a ground cover, to protect the soil, to keep the soil warm, to keep the soil sort of doing its thing. Classic cover crops are like winter rye, because it'll germinate at colder temperatures than most things will, and it'll grow at temperatures that most things won't. I don't like using winter rye because basically winter rye is great if you're planting to till your bed, but don't till the bed. Stop tilling your bed. Or like till once when you first start, don't till ever again. It's really hard on the soil. But if you're not tilling winter rye, you end up needing to like smother it for like a season for the roots to on and on and on. So if I'm going to cover crop, I use something like clover, which fixes nitrogen, increases, notably, I measured it in my own home, increases the quality of the soil year after year. And clover is easy to just like take a shovel and dig a hole in it and plant tomatoes, or plant whatever. Or just drop cardboard on top of it at the beginning of the season and then plant through that cardboard a month later. And all the nitrogen that the clover has fixed that was in the clover itself is now in the soil to feed the tomatoes. That does require buying new clover seed every year, but clover seed, if you're buying it 50 pounds at a time and stored in an airtight container, will keep yourself for years. It's not that bad. Often unless I'm doing a lot of big raised beds, I find cover cropping to be kind of overkill, particularly if you're doing containers. It's like, I find it to be way more work than it's used to get out of it utility wise. What I tend to just do is cover things with mulch in the off season and scoop the mulch on. Questions on this?
Okay, I'm still a little fuzzy on it. So during your growing season, you do leave the raised bed open, correct?
No, it's all mulched all the time.
So, but you're not, during your growing season, you're not covering it with like a plastic material or anything like that?
No, I don't mulch with anything except actual living dead material. I don't mulch. I'm not going to like get on a high horse about like mulching with plastic sheeting. I use that sometimes as a cover mulch if I'm trying to kill an area. Basically, if I'm trying to kill all the grass in an area, I'll lay down heavy black trash bags because I've got them as a waste product and other things, and leave them for a year or two to really kill the soil. But when you do that, UV degradation means you get all these little plastic bits and you get microplastics everywhere and stuff like that. And it's just, I think it's kind of junky, and I think it's not great. Again, if I'm going to do serious, if I were trying to, if you were like, here's this acre and I want to turn it into a food forest, and currently it's covered in like bittersweet poison ivy. Here's $10,000. I want a orchard here in 2 years. Okay, great. I'm going to hire a bush hog, trim it all down to like 2 inches tall, and I'm going to get giant rolls of industrial landscape fabric, not the stuff they sell at Home Depot, but the heavy duty stuff. And I'm going to roll that out, and I'm going to leave that there for a year, basically. I'm going to let the ground underneath it cook in the sun, let the water go through it, penetrate, and after a year has gone by, so that the seed bank of weeds is basically exhausted, then I'm going to pull it up a section at a time, plant trees, proper depth, lay down compost, lay down heavy wood chip mulch, lay down paths, and do that section at a time, so that the ground is never uncovered, except for the transitory times they do it stuff. But on a home scale, yeah, most of my sheet mulch is sheet mulch with cardboard. But yeah, no, my beds now, I just leave a layer of wood chips on everything all the time, and I literally just push it out of the way to create like a trench that I'm planting in. And the chips just break down over time, and the soil just gets thicker and deeper over time. It's 1,000 flowers, pretty much. I know I have friends that find weeding to be a very meditative activity. I hate weeding. If I was going to do more meditative work, I hate weeding. So I don't let weeds grow. I cover the ground and stuff. So weeding becomes, as I walk through, I just pull the occasional thing up, poking up through the wood chips. And Other kind of cover cropping I do. I cover crop with utility for things like strawberries. I'm slowly but surely getting strawberries growing in all my beds because I can plant them through the wood chips and then they will send runners over the wood chips and go down. And once strawberries have covered a bed, I stop adding wood chips. I let the strawberries cover. They do the mulch purposes. They protect the soil. They hold in moisture. They regulate temperature. They also grow strawberries occasionally, which I consider sort of a free gift from the universe. And again, it's not going to hurt my heart to just tear them out of the way to drop a tomato in the middle of it. There's very few things that have trouble with strawberries, particularly with strawberries or low growth. So yes, everything is covered all the time. It's covered with living material or it's covered with deliberately placed dead material. There's never bare soil. Bare soil is in the process of dying. I mean, literally, bare soil is a wound in the earth, and that wound is bleeding. So avoid that as much as you possibly can. Questions on this? I obviously have stronger opinions on mulch than most human beings. I've accepted that I'm different than the shoulders. It's okay. One of the things I've also found, the side benefit that again, I've got like couple of acres that have been slowly transforming. We moved in 2013 and basically it was 2 acres of what it basically golf course. The military haircut grass that got mowed twice a week, year round. Soil was compacted and hard. Water sheeted off the surface of it. It was cut trenches into the ground, the edge of the property. So the first thing I did was just stop doing that. I let the grass grow longer so that it got deeper roots. Then I moved to I only cut paths and cut the areas I want to use, and the rest of it I let it grow deep. I mow it like once or twice a year to keep like the bittersweet and multiple rows under control. But the rest of the year, I'll let it grow wild, and then I selectively mow. So some of the patches that I never cut now are patches full of yarrow or New England aster, fleabane daisy, bee balm, et cetera, et cetera. Again, my goal here is to spend less and less work to get more of the benefit. One of the things that has happened as I've done that, and I've mulched deeply. One of the things that mulching deeply does with those wood chips, it gets shot through with isopods and centipedes and spiders and worms and things like that. That plus all the nice tall grass means my yard has got full of songbirds. So these birds, as I walk the paths, the birds fly off, and that pleases me. But it also means my pest problems are effectively zero. I don't use any pesticides. I don't pick pests. I don't do anything. And basically the birds do all the work for me. I've managed to cultivate an ecosystem that is sufficiently self-sustaining that if I don't demand just incredibly intense production out of it, I don't have to do much at all. I show up, I plant the things, I occasionally show up to harvest stuff, I water if it gets bad. And that's about the extent of it. It's not nothing, but again, I don't know, there's some sort of weird thing that we have that gardening has to be like really, really difficult and labor intensive. And if it's not gardening or it's not meaningful. And again, I'd get paid better for this if I were going to do something that was really hard. So.
And I'm going to tell my wife, well said, don't mow the lawn.
Sounds good to me. Or as you mow and actually don't use mulching, instead use a catch mower and make piles of basically just green grass and brown leaves, make that be your compost supply. And when that rots down about half, mix it into the dirt. So the thing about wood chips, people mulch with wood chips and then they till the wood chips in. And like, my garden died. It's like, well, yeah, because you put a bunch of super nitrogen hungry wood 4 inches below the ground and it pulled all the nitrogen out of there and then it killed collapsed the food web. If you use wood chips, don't till them in at all, ever. Leave them on the surface. Just like with leaves, basically. Just think about a forest floor. Leave it on the surface. It will break down and make dirt. Don't try to speed that process up by tilling it in, by digging it in. That's where you get into trouble. And I think most of the complaints about wood chips people name ultimately come down to where, it's like it ties up all the nitrogen. It doesn't really. It ties up nitrogen where it is, which is the surface, which is not where your nitrogen is coming from anyway. It ties up nitrogen in the soil if you mix it into the soil. So don't do that. Oh, and I said I would try to not just tell you what I did and act like that was another thing. Wood chip mulch is a terrible choice for things like squash. It's a really great reservoir for squash beetles. I don't grow much squash, so I don't really care for squash that much. I turned out to be, I'm really good at growing butternut squash. And after my third year of growing like 200 pounds of butternut squash, which then sat on the shelves, because we don't really like butternut squash, I finally clued into the mistake I was making and instead grew watermelons and tomatoes. So yeah, not a perfect solution at all times in all places, but by and large, it's a phenomenal solution. And basically, if I have to choose between squash and wood chip mulch, I don't like squash that much. Access. Access is a shorter topic, but basically, how long are your arms? Because whatever your answer is, your raised bed or container shouldn't be more than twice that big, assuming you can access it from both sides. I've got pretty good arm length, but if I make a raised bed that's 6 feet across, I cannot comfortably get to the middle of it. And so that part won't get tended, won't get harvested, won't get dealt with. Or I'll walk on the bed to get to it, which you should never do. Don't walk on the soil you're growing on. Maintain paths, keep the paths, don't get off the paths. So in general, stop. The width of your raised bed should be 1.5 to 2 times your arms. That's assuming you can access it from both sides. If it's up against a house, make it the length of your arms or less because you can only get to one side, yeah? This seems really obvious when you say it out loud, but it's remarkable how easy it is to miss it in the excitement of building stuff. Space between beds or between beds and other obstacles, in my opinion, should be a minimum of 2 feet. Can you navigate between beds if there's just 1 foot? Sure. And I'm a reasonably agile guy. And if I'm navigating between 1 foot space between 2 beds and I step it all wrong, I'm going to fall sideways and either my knee or my ankle is going to go because I don't have any room to put the other foot. I'm going to fall. 2 feet means I have room to actually walk normally by and large. And again, that's just a human being who's got a fair width. If I were planning beds and I wanted to make sure I could access them with a walker or in my wheelchair, or as a person that had, my brother-in-law with cerebral palsy because a very pronounced limp, I would make them 3 feet apart because then they are more accessible to everyone. The beds in that garden, when I designed them and put them in, are spaced far enough apart, I believe, like all of what we said, that you can navigate a wheelchair. Are you planning to kneel down between the beds to do stuff? Then if there's only 18 inches between them, you can't turn to access the bed. Are you planning on using your rolling garden cart? Well, is there enough room to sit on the cart with your feet covered? Again, think through your spacing in this way. In terms of length, I like to make beds as long as I possibly can, limited only by basic lumber costs and availability. Because basically every time you cut a hole in it, it's like you start and stop the whole process. That said, functionally speaking, the standard that I put in is 8x4. 8 foot lumber is cheap to get and easy to get. One 8 foot thing cut in half is 4 feet long. My arms can comfortably reach 2 feet in from one side, 2 feet in from the other. But yeah, think about location. Don't just think about access to you. What else needs to be able to access a big raised bed or a big container?
Water.
Good. Where's your water supply? Where you have to bring it from? What else? Yeah, that mulch and that soil. You get a dump truck load of soil to load? Also, can it be delivered into the beds? If not, can you get a wheelchair or a wheelbarrow or garden cart between the two? Because if not, that's a whole lot of 5-gallon buckets to take one bucket at a time to fill. I mean, boy, filling like a waist-high container full of soil by the 5-gallon bucket is one of those like punishments in Dante stuff. So yeah, access to supplies. Also, I'm growing tomatoes and it's going great. I've got 50 pounds in there. Awesome. How are you getting the tomatoes out? Like, do you have room to put a bushel basket down, put the tomatoes into? Can you comfortably carry that back to where you're going? Think about that. Who is going to be accessing these beds when? Questions on access? Seasons. Basically, beware of seasonal change. This relates to stuff we've already said, but you know, okay, I'm growing tomatoes. All right, that means you're probably buying plants around here in May, putting them in the ground in May, and they're going to grow through. Honestly, my tomatoes grow until there's the first hard frost. And again, if they're in a raised bed, you can often get an extra week or so out of them because cold air settles. But so then October, maybe. What's that bed doing the rest of the year? Because the answer is I don't know. It's just sitting there full of dirt. That is not the right answer. I'm sad. It made me feel bad.
That was my answer.
So, if the answer is after I pull the tomato, the dead frost pulp tomatoes out, that's when I spread an even thicker layer of wood chip mulch to leave it for the rest of the year. That is an acceptable answer. That's when I plant the winter cover crops. Great answer. These are all good answers, but I just leave the bare dirt. I don't know. That's please don't do that. It hurts me when you do that. So yeah. Also, again, I know I hammer on the bare dirt thing, but whatever you do, think about that you'll need to be able to clean the bed out, move the mulch out the way, whatever. If you just leave it untended for like a third or more of the year, then you're going to have a lot of work cleaning it out every year. You're going to build up a bank of weed seeds in it because it's just sat and things have been replicated in it. And they're going to deplete the soil, and it's going to get baked in the heat and what it on and on and on. Dude, you know, take care of things. They'll do better for you. Finally, the place that most people start and I end on because in some sense it's the least important part.
Right,
What are you going to
well,
plant there?
before you get off seasons, for winter growing, which I don't do, if you're doing winter growing, will that also deplete the soil?
I mean, anytime you're harvesting something off of an area, you're depleting the soil in the sense that the nutrients that are embodied in that habitat or whatever have now left the building, and they have to be replaced eventually. Doesn't matter, summer, winter, whatever. But that's not really hard to do if you're feeding the bed mulch and compost like you're replacing it with foam. You know, I did an entire talk on polycultures and plant guilds. That's the whole topic of long hours. But think about for a container. Think about your successional planting. That is, if you plant the same stuff every year in a raised bed or a container, just like in the ground, you tend to build up disease vectors in the soil. You tend to deplete micronutrients. So have a rotation. Label stuff. I'll remember it. No, you won't. Don't lie to yourself. That hurts my heart. UV radiation is remarkably destructive on almost all labels. And what I found honestly works some of the best is pencil and popsicle sticks. Popsicle sticks will last for a season, then I fell into the compost. But the pencil doesn't degrade. Permanent marker degrades very quickly, surprisingly, UV radiation. Some people apparently get, if you can get like vinyl siding, like extra strips of that, and just like cut it into pieces. The, permanent marker on that, like Sharpie marker on that, tends to bond real well apparently, and will last and last and last. But I don't like the look of plasticky bits in the garden. So again, popsicle sticks with pencil. You have to get close to read the pencil, but the pencil persists through rain and heat. Marker does not appear to, at least in my experience. You can also get, I mean, the really like copper or metal ones that you scratch in are permanent, but those are great if I'm planting like fruit trees and they're planting to be here 30 years, but it adds up real quickly to be like, tomatoes, oh, not next year, in the trash. But yeah, label, and more than that, document. I end up storing a whole lot of stuff in my email account because my Gmail account, I can search it very easily. And there's a draft email that I've had open for years in my drafts folder because it'll never be finished because it's a running log of what's planted where. So it literally says things like, from driveway facing garage, turn right, go 3 steps. This variety of willow tree bought at this time from this place. That variety goes all the way to the end. 3 feet down from that to the south, blah, blah, you know, and so there's a log somewhere in the cloud of plants. And then I also label and I also have other documentation, but I try not to lose track of that because I don't want to 10 years from now be like, man, this is great. It's an apple, I'm pretty sure, but like, I don't know beyond that. And there's 10,000 varieties of those. Particularly since I've gotten stuff from not just a dozen companies, but I've gotten it, neighbors have dropped stuff on. This is such and such. Enjoy. Better write that down while I can, because if I don't, it's gone. The other reason to label and document. End of the year, what went wrong? What went well? You talked about, I planted it with peat moss and it tasted like peat moss. Awesome. Don't do it again. Yeah, like journal that. Try something different next year. Record, be a good scientist. Think in terms of what variables you can change. Or is it is the logo of my household. I swear I'm someday going to get translated into like High Latin and embossed so we can hang it somewhere. But our household motto is make new mistakes. And that's almost an imperative. Like, no, go forth and make new mistakes. Try
Try
new
thing is
things.
when the kids are clearing out all your effects when you're gone, is that can all be composted.
Exactly. If they would let me just compost me when I'm dead. As Diogenes said, when I'm dead, just throw my body over the walls. The animals may eat it. And people are like, well, won't that? Doesn't that bother you? And it's like, well, just give me a stick then to defend myself. And they're like, well, why would you need a stick if you're dead? It's like, well, if we're just admitting that I'm dead, why would it bother me? Okay. Questions about plants and data. Again, what plants you plant, what spacing you plant, go on and on about that. The big thing I'll throw in there is think about orientation towards the sun. Your bed is facing south like it ought to. What goes in the northernmost part of the bed?
Shrub, a small tree.
Tall stuff. Good.